Greetings, everybody. Welcome to our first panel of the afternoon on the history of technology. I hope that you all had an enjoyable lunch and have gotten all of the sustenance you need for our engaging panels this afternoon. My name is Zachary Loeb. I'm a PhD candidate in the department trying to finish up a dissertation on Y2K, and I have the privilege today of introducing our phenomenal panel, which I shall do right now. Ruth Schwartz Cowan is a Professor Emerita in the History and Sociology of Science Department at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of Sir Francis Galton and the Study of Heredity in the 19th Century, The Social History of American Technology, Heredity and Hope, The Case for Genetic Screening, and More Work for Mother, which won the 1984 Dexter Prize from the Society for the History of Technology. Her contributions to the field have been recognized with, among other awards, the Society for the Social Studies of Science's J.D. Bernal Prize, the Society for the History of Technology's highest honor, the Leonardo da Vinci Medal. Her research has been supported by the NSF, the NIH, ACLS, the Sloan Foundation, and other institutions. Whitney Laemmli is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Carnegie Mellon University. Her current book project, Measured Movements, Science and Human Motion in the 20th Century, is forthcoming. Her article, A Case in Point, Romance and Regimentation in the New York City Ballet, was awarded the 2018 Abbott Pace and Usher Prize for the best article published in Technology and Culture in the preceding 3 years. Her research has been supported by the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Max Planck Institute, the NSF, and other institutions. Stephanie Dick is an assistant professor in the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University. She is the co-editor with Janet Abate of the volume Abstractions and Embodiments, New Histories of Computing and Society. Her current book project, Making Up Minds, Computing and Proof in the Post-War United States, is forthcoming. She's a co-organizer of the annual SIGSIS conference, sits on the editorial board for the IEEE Annals of the History of Computing, and is the co-editor of the Mining the Past column at the Harvard Data Science Review. Her research has been supported by the Turing Centenary Research Project, the William F. Milton Fund, the NSF, and other institutions. Amy Slaton is a professor of history at Drexel University. She is the author of Reinforced Concrete and the Modernization of American Building, 1900 to 1930, Race, Rigor, and Selectivity in U.S. Engineering, The History of an Occupational Color Line. She edited the volume New Materials Towards a History of Consistency, and she is one of the co-editors of the international journal History and Technology. Her research has been supported by the Center for Nanotechnology, Harvard University, the Chemical Heritage Foundation, the NSF, and other institutions. Deborah Fitzgerald is the Leverett Howell and William King Cutton Professor of the History of Technology and the program in Science, Technology, and Society at MIT. She is the author of The Business of Breeding, Hybrid Corn in Illinois, 1890 to 1920, and Every Farm a Factory, The Industrial Ideal in American Agriculture, which won the 2003 Theodore Salutis Prize for the best book of the year from the Agricultural History Society. Her research has been supported by the Mellon Foundation, the NSF, and other institutions. And our moderator for the day, Elly Truitt, is an associate professor in the History and Sociology of Science Department at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of Medieval Robots, Mechanism, Magic, Nature, and Art, and the forthcoming book, Marvelous Inventions, Roger Bacon, The Middle Ages, and the Making of Modern Science. Her research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the Huntington Library, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, and other institutions, and I shall turn it over to her now.
Everybody, thank you so much. This is Zachary Loeb, one of our advanced graduate students, and I just want to say that I'm really grateful to him, but also for all of the work of our graduate students in putting on this tremendous event. Everyone has been pitching in, so thanks to Zachary, but also to all his colleagues. So just to briefly reintroduce myself to some of you whom I've not yet met, I joined the department in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. I did not move into my office or meet my colleagues and students in person until about a year ago. And I want to say that it's a tremendous testament to the community of the HSS department here at Penn that the difficulties and kind of alienation that those circumstances could have really emphasized were actually muted and really ameliorated because of this wonderful community. So when I was asked to moderate this panel, I jumped at the chance because, as you guys can all see, the past, present, and future of the history of technology at Penn HSS is female. And before we get too excited about that, as I'm sure we all know, that of course means that the history of technology soon will become de-emphasized and less prestigious as a subfield. But this panel, I think, we are truly, what an embarrassment of riches to be able to call upon this really tremendous, extraordinary, and humane group of scholars in the history of technology whose work has taken us and who have helped us all understand everything from how one of the oldest technologies, agriculture, intersects with the much newer pressures of industrialization, to how technology, gender, and unanticipated consequences can often go together. And again, I think personally, Ruth, I want to thank you for your book, More Work for Mother. But I think also kind of demonstrating to us the ways in which, again, the social and the cultural are never outside of the technological, but always in it and of it. So with that in mind, today I wanted to ask our panelists to just spend a few moments each responding to some broad prompts that I gave them. And I will, spoiler alert, tell you what they are now, but also kind of re-prompt throughout. So the first is kind of a broad sense of the field, like what were and have been the most pressing concerns or challenges facing the history of technology, and what feels urgent in the field today, and what keeps these scholars committed to the history of technology, if indeed they still remain committed to it. And then we move to lacunae, like what kinds of topics and methods are under or unexplored, and what other disciplines, either adjacent to the history of technology or perhaps quite orthogonal to it, do they find most generative? Then I kind of think about sort of surprise and uncertainty. I'm interested in knowing from these scholars what over the course of their research has really surprised them and why. And then what still remains opaque or mysterious or difficult to explain or understand. And then finally, I asked them to think about how what they have read, including the work of many people here, and written, how that has changed them as thinkers and scholars. So with that said, I will just turn it over. First, I've asked Ruth Cowan to start us off talking about the first prompt, this kind of major concerns and questions of the field that kind of animated it when you began. And then what do you see as the most urgent questions now? Thank you so much.
Let me start by saying that I still subscribe. I've retired for 10 years, but I still subscribe to technology and culture, to social studies of science, and to ISIS. And the one that brings the most pleasure to read over breakfast is still technology and culture. I absolutely love how in the last 3 or 4 years, actually beginning around the time I retired, which is the time in which technology and culture became global. This is one of the most important things to me that's happening in the field. When I started, my first SHOP meeting was in 1973. It was a time when SHOP was so small that we all met. There was only one session there weren't competing sessions. You only went to one session at a time. And it was just emerging. I didn't understand this at the time. But it was just emerging as the history of science had emerged a decade or so earlier from being the pursuit of retired engineers. And when I was trained in the history of science, which was in the early 60s, most people who were writing in the history of science were scientists. And when I was awarded a fellowship that allowed me to go to graduate school, it was on the understanding that all of the graduate students would have been science majors as undergraduates, and that you were going to write about the history of the science you knew. So I was going to write about the history of biology. At the time, historians of physics thought there was no history of biology, and if there was one, it didn't correspond to the philosophy of logic, of empiricism that physics did. So I was an outlier to start with. And what drew me to the history of technology was a revulsion against the history of ideas. My dissertation, which was a history of the founder of the discipline of biometrics, Sir Francis Galton, but he's also the founder of the eugenics movement, which is why my dissertation was one of the first in the history of science to combine social and political issues with the history of science and to see how they interacted with each other. But I had it once I turned that into a book. I wanted to go into a field, and I was drawn into it by a course that I taught at Stony Brook in those years, in which there was something material and concrete that I could talk about. And what I love about the history of technology today is two things. The first, that it's gone global, and the second, that it has become possible to do big database studies in the history of technology. What a change to be able to look at the entire patent record in a certain category on your computer without having to go to the office, to the library, and get the patent records. Very few libraries have the U.S. patent records. It changed. Digital humanities has changed the history of technology. To be able to scan, just to think of an article that blew me out of the water, the parliamentary record on the construction of canals, and to do a content analysis of it at the flick of a key. Those are the two things that keep me happily reading TNC.
So I'll also start out by talking about technology and culture, in part because I'm currently on Schott's Usher Prize Committee, which meant that over the summer I spent a month reading 3 years of TNC back to back. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about the experience of that kind of concentrated infusion of at least one corner of the field. So the first thing that stuck out to me, to echo Ruth and others, is how much more geographically expansive the field has become, even since I began. I think this is particularly true in say, East Asia. It's the coverage of the globe is by no means even, but I think the concerted efforts to expand have begun to pay off. And the second kind of group of articles I was struck by, and this is probably, if you had to put articles into categories, the largest number would be pieces that bridge the history of technology and environmental history. There's obviously a long tradition of this kind of work, and I think many people from Penn, including on this panel, who are exemplars of it. But I think it's continued to accelerate in recent years, in part because as we're increasingly confronting the realities of climate change. And more generally, I think the field's at a moment where its political relevance has become quite starkly clear. And a lot of scholars are struggling to think about how their work might speak to the present, whether that's environment, whether that's labor and capitalism, race, disability, or the challenges posed by new information and media technologies. Again, I want to echo a lot of Jeremy's comments from this morning, saying I think the best of this work is not about abandoning history and chasing whatever crisis is most current. We don't need to become journalists. There are journalists who are very good at that. There's expertise in other fields. But I think we can deploy our historical expertise to challenge the idea that these problems are entirely new, and to help explain how we arrived where we are. I talk to my students a lot about technological choice. It's a very simple concept, but one that has often not occurred to them until it's posed in this very straightforward way. And that's something I think the field is very good about, understanding contingency. So these kind of high political stakes are certainly one thing that keeps me invested in the field. It motivates my teaching a great deal, especially at an institution where the majority of students are going into science and engineering, and my class may be only one of two where they take a humanities approach. It's also very satisfying because it's actually fairly easy to blow their minds with just a little bit of cultural context. But it does feel like a place where the field certainly has an impact. The other thing that has always attracted me about the history of technology is its capaciousness. The way that methods derived from the history of technology can be used to answer a really wide array of historical questions. Like most people coming out of this program, I wouldn't necessarily identify myself as strictly or solely a historian of technology, but someone who's interested in knowledge, in culture, and power, who uses these methods to help me understand broader historical phenomena. And one of the things I've been struck by working in a normal history department is how eager our graduate students, whatever field they're working are, to learn from the history of technology's methods. We have a few graduate students in the history of science, technology, and medicine, but most of them, even if they're 19th century historians of gender, are actually very excited about the kind of tools for thinking about materiality and systems and structures that the history of technology presents. And I think that's really exciting and satisfying to me.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to start by saying what a pleasure it is to be here. And like John this morning, I feel a bit like an interloper because I am not an alumnus of the department. And yet, like John, I felt as though in joining the faculty at Penn HSS, I received something like a second education from the first one that I had received in the history of science department at Harvard, where things were done much differently, and where the history of technology was done almost not at all, except by Adelheid Voskuhl, who is now in the Penn HSS department. And so I did not identify as a historian of technology for much of my career, and came to do so through the history of computing, which brings with it a number of its own concerns and very insider baseball questions that I won't bring to the table today. But in response to this question, I wanted to speak to something that I felt I learned about the history of technology through my peers and colleagues in the Penn department that I think still remain really essential questions for the department. I think even more than the history of science, the history of technology has really struggled to know where to look. It has a question at the heart of it, which is, should our gaze be fixed on the machine, on its makers, on the corporations that produce it, on its users, on its maintainers, on its effects? And one way to frame, I think, this discourse about what the history of technology is might be to ask, in what context must our technologies be situated in order for us to understand them, their politics, their meanings? And you can look at the entire history of computing almost as a shift in what context historians have believed you needed to consider in order to explain the machine. A context that begins with the machine itself, expands to include the biography of people like Alan Turing or John von Neumann, as though their lives sufficed to explain these machines and the impact they would have on society. There was then a move to include institutions, universities, businesses, corporations in the history of computing, that maybe it's not enough to know about Bill Gates. One must also know about IBM. One must also know about the Moore School at Pennsylvania, at our university. And this expanding notion of context in more recent years has led to studies of the history of computing in other parts of the world that look very different from the stories told about this rather essential machine in the early years when I started graduate school. And I wanted to cite something. I'm going to try to do this all through the day. So Sebastian Gilreano, who is chairing this morning, we were at a dinner after one of the Monday workshops. I don't even remember what the talk was about. I don't remember anything except what Sebastian said. It was one of these things that really landed with me, where he said the study of decolonization, of empire, of colonialism comes down in a certain sense to what you think constitutes the relevant context for what you're trying to explain. So if you want to understand the prominence or the relevance of AI, Is it enough to look at MIT, at RAND, at IBM, or must you also look at the role those institutions played in America's imperialism during the Cold War? Must you also situate those things in these longer histories of which most historians of technology hadn't really looked? And I think this is what the field is struggling with today. There have been a number of attempts in the history of technology to do what Heidi articulated to me as invert power relations. I was asking Heidi many years ago, Heidi, what's this movement to talk about users about? I want to know what the users people are trying to do. And Heidi said, by looking at users rather than creators, inventors, developers, entrepreneurs, scientists, the idea was to try to subvert power relations. There's been a similar movement more recently called the maintainers that says rather than focus on innovation, we should focus on maintenance. And Etienne Benson in Anna Muser's general exam said, but most people are neither innovators nor maintainers. Most people are not inventors or users in any strict sense of the term. There's a way in which these dichotomies and our inversions of them place us in the same trap, which is to define everybody's significance by their relationship to the machine. And I think we're all reckoning these days with the notion that there are some forms of critique and critical engagement that actually reinforce and reproduce the hegemony of the thing being critiqued. And that by defining everyone according to their relationship to the machine, we may be doing some of that in the history of technology. So that's like the trajectory that I think feels closest to home and brings in some of these lessons from colleagues at Penn. And it's also, I think, one of the things I wrestle with a lot in my own work today.
First, I have to say, Ruth, I can't believe you don't have a 4th subscription to History and Technology. I just got to say, I can get you a discount now. So that's the...
There are limits to the time I can see.
All right, we'll step outside later. No. So that, and the only thing I would say about, so I co-edit History and Technology with Tiago Saraiva, my colleague at Drexel, and I would just say one thing about it is, it's interesting because it is not associated with an existing organization. Except in our minds, right? So it's kind of got some interesting, we hope it's got some interesting angles it brings in. But thanks all, and thanks, Elly, for the very interesting prompts. And I'm going to say that I kind of got stuck on that notion of urgencies and pressing concerns. And I have to say, quite honestly, that I'm going to tell you about my concerns. I don't know. I can't say at this point how widely they configure the field, but I've heard hints of them in our previous conversations here. So I think for me, the most urgent issue facing the history of technology and the history of science and medicine is how to avoid shoring up the conditions that have materially sustained the field. That is the conditions that have sustained the Euro-American University, and John mentioned these earlier, and Joanna hinted at them too, which of course are the conditions of white domination, the distributions of wealth that come with capitalism, very timid responses to climate change, the perpetuation of debt. These are all the material operations that brought me here today. And I think that there's a way in which the sense of our field, which I definitely learned at Penn, of how reasonable it is to imagine transformation through critique, which is not my phrase, it's a phrase that K. Wayne Yang has used to describe the liberal humanistic university, it's just not conducive to redistribution. It's not the same as grappling with those material conditions. And I've become particularly concerned because my own area of study now is the history of ideas of difference and diversity in STEM arenas. I find the idea of inclusion to be particularly vexing because I think it has, for reasons I think I'm starting to understand it, it has avoided or evaded historical interrogation. And I think it's often promoted by those like me who are already inside or believe we're inside some important and meaningful enterprise like, history or history of technology. And I think it can be very self-consoling. And I think it needs to be historicized. And I actually think we're in a pretty good place to do it. I think the history of science, technology, and medicine, and I can't quite speak of them separately because I came through this program at a point when speaking of them separately was something you had to justify, so I'm going to save time and just not separate them. But I think the history of STM, it doesn't have an exceptional role to play, but it has a particular role to play in this thinking. And that for me is that to do our historical studies, we traffic in and rely on ideas of efficacy, right? We study achievement, contribution, productivity. We follow our subject's agency, right? And we follow agency of particular kinds. What counts as knowledge or discovery of the world? What counts as a useful cosmology in a time and place? What counts as making? What counts as healing? And I think that in our discourse, it is very easy to feel that we can make a more capacious definition of what counts, but that essentially that is a recuperative project that does not disrupt our authority. It certainly does not approach our epistemic security. And instead, I want to suggest that, at least the way I was taught, that the history of science, technology, and medicine can come to understand that our invocation of mastery, our invocation of efficacy, no matter how capacious the definition is, no matter how many cultures and cosmologies we include, is itself a historical move. It's itself a kind of making of subjects. And I don't just mean that we go around making of subjects, this community or this culture or this individual is worthy of our study. I mean, we go around making subjects, right? We create them as types and representatives and as, ontological creations. And so I know that sounds like kind of maybe an abstracted path towards, reparation or redistribution, but I think this program empowered me to ask these questions. And I think of taking classes with Judy McGaw and Charles Rosenberg that came very strongly out of social history and labor history. I think of taking courses with Rob Kohler and Ricky Kuklik that were all about asking questions of why is that knowledge considered knowledge and not something else? I mean, that problematization of certainty, of the knowing of knowing, was something that I came out of pen in hand. And then I'm going to shout out to my neighbor, Deborah, who, after I finished at Penn, I sat in on her graduate course on the history of work at MIT, and that brought it all together. And I feel like that was quite a while ago, but I feel like it set me up at least to be vexed, which is something. But of course, the real problem is, and I think John and Joanna captured this really well earlier, is that our rubrics of success, our metrics of success in our scholarship are themselves not conducive to redistribution. And we've touched on this, right? This notion of, very old familiar things like published to perish, and now we have many, many brilliant colleagues in non-research positions. The humanities are under assault. But I think also, we really need to imagine that what we do is in opposition to rematriation of land grant property. It's in opposition to, disinvestment and the end of debt. And I really like that idea we heard earlier about standing up to the constructions of the university as, a costly, in every way, a costly cultural project. I also want to suggest something that for me is reaching across both my historical studies and my reflection on the discipline, which of course are not really separable. And that is, I've really found it helpful to start saying to myself that the opposite of exclusion is not inclusion. The opposite of exclusion is something we have yet to imagine. And I just want to kind of put that out there as something I think this set of disciplines is really well equipped to spend time with. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I'm kind of daunted here. I'm going to go back to the beginning a little bit and talk a little bit about what was going on in the field when I joined the department. Like somebody else mentioned, having had a pretty good history of science background, coming into graduate school, that was my situation too. But I came here and remained completely betwixt and between the history of science and the history of technology. I came here wanting to study the history of genetics and eugenics, and who showed up the very first day I came up with that idea but Dan Kevles, who was working on a little book on the history of eugenics and genetics, and I took one look at him and listened to him for 1 minute and said, I need a new project. Not big enough a world for the two of us. So I was always attracted to the history of technology, partly because I felt more at home there. And the historians of technology will recognize this constant refrain, we are friendly, we take people in, and the waifs of your are welcome here. And certainly I felt that way when I went to a SHOT meeting, as so many people do. But I also really liked the materiality, just as Ruth said. I loved the materiality of the study. And it was a much more comfortable place for me than theories of science of any sort, which I just recoiled from. I had no interest in it. It didn't appeal to me at all. So, but constantly I was going back and forth. Is this technology? Is this science? Who cares? What does it matter? And so I find myself feeling a little funny sitting on this panel of real historians of technology because, in fact, you know, I feel like a little bit of a hybrid creature myself.
To coin
Ha
a
ha.
phrase.
Yeah. What?
To coin a phrase.
To coin a phrase. Sorry about that. It's never far away. Also, I wanted to say something about the department and why the department, I think, has had, some of the ways the department had a huge impact on me. I mean, pretty much everything about me is because of this department, good, bad, and indifferent. But one of the people who hasn't really been mentioned too much, who had a big impact on me, I did not work with him much, but Alex Vucinich was an unbelievable teacher and just generally lovely person who took people in. And the class that he was teaching when I was a first-year student was on the history of institutions. What could be drier? What could be more dull? It was the most powerful class I took in my entire time, no offense to anyone else, because it really situated how you can think about knowledge, how you can think about power, how you can think about the persistence of certain things through time that had been really bugging me heavily. And it's something that has always, it went out of favor very quickly, if it ever was in favor, the history of institutions. Our graduate students really have a negative interest in something called that because it sounds so dreary. But honestly, I think that is one of the biggest things this department developed as an analytical frame for looking at science and technology. And it's something that distinguishes people I see at conferences and tells me where they came from. So, hats off to Alex, who was wonderful. And the other person I took a class with who really made an impact was Michael Katz. If some of you remember Michael Katz, who was teaching sociology of what?
Labor?
Education, labor, God knows what it was. But again, hugely important thinker on these kinds of structural circumstances of life that, again, to me, kind of stands in for a big part of the Penn program, even though he was not, of course, in our program. So I just wanted to sort of get that thing off my chest, but also to think about what the history of technology was like when I started, and no surprise, it was mostly men, mostly white. Well, they were all white men, weren't they? And the thing that I'm working with Tom. Again, my advisor was Charles Rosenberg, so all of this is very funny to me that I'm talking about all these other people. So working with Tom Hughes, of course, everything was about the machine and understanding the machine and who was it who recalled being devastated by being asked to go to I think it was
Gabrielle,
Gabrielle,
yeah.
and then sure enough, that's the kind of thing he would do in class, show me how a smelter works, draw a picture of a smelter on the board. That kind of stuff was very common, and that wasn't really my cup of tea either. But then Judy McGaugh came in and brought us a whole nother way of looking at the history of technology, which was much more gendered and much more social relations oriented. So between the two, it was quite a powerful training in the field, I think, and very distinctive. But again, when I think about these early years, what I really think about is something that I didn't entirely appreciate when I was here until I went to Stockholm. And it's in Stockholm, when they thought about our program, there was one word they thought of, and that was systems. It was all about systems. And, we didn't really talk about it that much here in the halls of Tom Hughes. I don't recall, really.
You could, but...
We didn't, though. I mean, we didn't really talk about it. And it is the thing that we are known for in a lot of the world. So, between knowing the machines themselves and knowing about systems and using the concept of systems to open up other venues was really did become important, particularly as it echoed back to us, I think, in the field more generally, and as it showed up in adjacent fields without our really realizing how it got there. Finding it in anthropology or in labor studies or all kinds of places where suddenly systems were the thing. So I thought that was hugely interesting. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And I was just going to say, a number of you actually talked about the sort of second prompt was kind of what disciplines or methods from other disciplines do you guys all find most generative? And I will say that you guys largely gestured at that. We heard about digital humanities and material culture, gender studies, labor history, anthropology, environmental history, and environmental studies. So what I'll say is, I'm going to say in the interests of time, and so that we can also have a robust discussion, I'll pass over that particular one and just urge you to, you can bring in more for this, for the next two, if that is fitting. And I'll say, I want to now ask you guys to reflect on, over the course of your research, we'd love to hear about what has surprised you and why, and what, if anything, remains opaque or mysterious. And I think actually we won't have the same person start each time. That feels unfair. So I think I'll ask Whitney. Why don't you start us off with this?
But I will say I actually really like this question about surprise because I think that's where my current book project comes from. So I'll just talk about it briefly. It's really rooted in surprise. Very briefly, I'm writing about a technology for recording movement on paper called Levant notation. It was originally developed in the world of avant-garde dance in Weimar, Germany, and is still used in the arts today to record movement. But what drew me to the project were the claims made by some of this system's most devoted and really militant contemporary users that it had traveled far beyond dance. So it had ended up in places like white-collar management consulting and psychiatric hospitals and NASA engineering labs. And so I approached these claims with what I hope was the appropriate degree of historical skepticism, and was in fact very surprised to find that these boosters were in fact telling the truth, that it did go to all of these places. And in fact, it's still with us, including, among other things, powering those very creepy Boston Dynamics dancing robots you may have seen in YouTube videos, and in some new surveillance technologies designed to assess human emotion. And so again, this surprise is kind of what brought me to the project, helping me ask why this very diverse set of actors all latched onto this particular tool, and what we might learn from this shared interest in recording and controlling the moving human body. So I bring this up in part because I think it highlights something really wonderful about the history of technology more generally, and that's the way that following objects or tools or practices can help us reveal continuities and connections that might otherwise be difficult to see, This is obviously helpful when we're looking at places or times where there aren't a lot of written records, but also in situations where people are concealing, whether actively or unknowingly, the true aims and origins and political implications of their projects. And so even when they refuse to speak about what they're doing, many of my actors are really quite mute about the aims of their projects. By seeing kind of the ideas and assumptions embedded in this technology, we can better understand their genealogy and what it all means. I think, I'm not sure, I mean, many things remain opaque to me about about the field itself and its boundaries and how I fit into it. I'm not sure I have an answer there, but I would say I still am both kind of surprised and not surprised by the public's tendency to look to technology as an uncomplicated savior. I think that's also something that has really changed even over the course of my relatively short career. When I started TAing at Penn, it was a much heavier lift to get students to see technology as political, and now I think my students are coming in at least much more open to that orientation. But I think, there's actually a wonderful article in Technology and Culture by Robert McDougall about the Keeley motor, this perpetual motion machine that attracted a lot of attention in the 19th century, and all of the varied reasons that people became attracted to it. And I see Keeley as kind of an Elon Musk figure, but I think there's a lot of work to be done in the history of technology by thinking about, the roots of the, appeal of technology as a solution that are not just practical, but are also about aesthetics and emotions and effective experiences. So,
amazing. Bear with me, this isn't going to sound good when I start, but I one of the things that surprised me the most about bringing a historical eye to the history of technology, and in particular the history of computing and cybernetics and systems engineering, is something that, again, a number of people from Penn have been thinking and talking about for a long time. But I was shocked and surprised and deeply existentially troubled to discover some extremely profound similarities between what I think historians of science take themselves to be doing a lot of the time and what a lot of my historical actors take themselves to be doing a lot of the time. And this struck me maybe in a most pronounced way when I started studying expert systems research in early AI. These were guys who wanted to build automated databases of knowledge. And so their core question is, what do we know? How do we know it? Can it be encoded? Can we put it into the computer? Can we make automated databases of our knowledge? And I had this really uncanny magic mirror feeling of encountering this discipline that gets all the answers wrong, right? They're wrong in every way about what knowledge is and how it's made and what it does and how it works according to our standards. But they're asking all of the same questions, and sort of following that rabbit hole all the way down leads to, I think, a really urgent reckoning that our own fields need to realize the ways that our methods, our vocabulary, our practices are entangled with the history of the social sciences, its relationship to cybernetics, its relationship to systems engineering, its relationship to the Cold War. I know that Joanna Radin is working with a grad student at Yale, looking both at Latour's Catholicism and his relationship to cybernetics as explanatory of some of his theories of science. I know that Sam Shervar, Cameron, Anna, Muser, many of the current graduate students in the current History of Science department are doing this type of self-reflective work. And this theme came up this morning around the concept of neutrality and possibly liberalism, which I'd love to say a bit more about as well. But I think we are in a moment where these surprising and uncanny entanglements and relationships that our own disciplines bear to those that we're in the business of critiquing could be something we put in the center of our discourse. When I hear people tell the history of what history of science is and does, and history of technology as well, we tend to tell a history of our own theories. This is how we got from the strong program through deconstruction to critical race theory. This is how we entered feminist discourse with science, technology, and society discourse. but we don't always bring the same level of analysis and reflection to our own methods. I find it very interesting that historians of science, including myself, continue to use relatively unreflectively, very Fordist language to talk about what knowledge is. Knowledge production, knowledge circulation, knowledge consumption. When I hear arguments like the same logics of colonialism are at work here in 18th century factories in Scotland and here in the 21st century United States, that sounds to me like a systems engineering kind of argument where you abstract away from material specificity the relationships and order that we are interested in identifying. And so I've been deeply surprised both by some of the uncanny similarities that exist between our own methods and those of the people we claim to be historicizing, contextualizing, and critiquing. And I've also been surprised by how it seems to be only people at Penn or who have been through Penn who are talking about it. Joy Rohde's work speaks explicitly to this, and so do many others in the room here. So that was a lesson I learned in part through collaboration with people at Penn. Susan's latest book touches on this point, of course, as well. So I'm very grateful for all of the insights that make this clear, and it remains one of the things that surprises me the most is both those relationships and the degree to which we have somewhat unthoughtfully continued to use tools that we borrow from our historical actors without always reflecting on what that means politically or epistemically.
Thank you, Stephanie, for using the word uncanny, because it's just the word I was looking for. And I first want to mention real quickly something that has surprised and delighted me, which is that it just gets better and better. This field of study for me gets more and more satisfying. Like every year I do it, there's more astonishment, and the uncanniness is I feel it all the more strongly. And I think that part of it, I guess I was trying to kind of, when we got this prompt, I was sort of trying to think about this, which is that I think once you have seen science or technology or medicine, once you have seen ordering of that kind, empiricism or description or representation, once you see it in action, you can't unsee it. And this is particularly, I mean, it is mind-blowing for my students, but it is mind-blowing for me every day, the work that taxonomies do, the work that quantification and classification do. And of course, we have many brilliant folks who've written on this. But I mean, I just have to say, at least one person in this room, and they will remain nameless, has gotten a text from me in the last week. I was in a store in another country, and I was buying orange juice. And in that country, which will not remain nameless, I was in Lisbon. The orange juice comes with a rating of how much pulp it has. 1 is a little pulp, 2 is more pulp, how much pulp. And this is called the pulpometer, right? And once you start seeing how measurement makes the world, you cannot unsee it. And of course, this is absolutely true of any other taxonomy, race and gender, and I actually have found, and I didn't get to mention this, I want to make sure I say this, and I have found the literature of disability studies to be incredibly generative for making measurements, metrics of productivity and efficacy strange. I mean, that is remarkable. And queer theory, queer studies, queer history has done remarkable work on who counts as a palatable citizen, a palatable. Or there are just so many other disciplines that are contributing to this. So that has been a constant source of satisfaction and delight and surprise to me, and it's fabulous. And I feel just so lucky to have been given this way of seeing the world. I think it is also was the prompt, what do we find mysterious
or opaque.
Or opaque. And I think, same thing, right? And like, how does this keep working? How does this work? How does this ordering do its political work? I mean, it enacts harm. It can also enact care, right? And I think that the ontological adventures of science and technology studies have been immensely helpful for me, but they're not necessarily I think I'd have to say, unlike systems descriptions, right, ontology just is never settled with its own parameters. It's never takes for granted that it's found the edges of its subject, right? And so it leads to some confusion. Am I looking at the right things? Is this where I should demarcate my subject? And I guess I'd say also, it just leads to this other weirdly challenging question that I'm making no progress on at all, which is how are history and the historian made together, right? I know I have a positionality. I know I have an institutional, platform. I know I have a gender, or I'm told I have a gender, right? It's a mysterious, and it seems to me fairly important ontology of the historian and history being made together, but it's got appeal. I'm still hoping I'll be able to make some progress on it. So those are my delights and my, my terrors.
It's really easy to say what I have found most surprising. I think I'm mushing together a couple of your prompts, actually. But when I think about what have I found that's most mysterious or surprising, it is the moment not that long ago when I realized that for over 30 years, I have been teaching the history of technology, and in particular, technology in New England, including the Lowell mills and all of that, without once mentioning slavery. Mm. That is the big surprise to me, is how did we get through school never talking about slavery? It blows my mind. We talked about trade, but we didn't talk about what kind of trade. We talked about, mercantilism, but we didn't talk about a couple of the legs of that journey. We didn't talk about what made the Lowell Associates so damn rich that they could build these wonderful mills and weave this cotton and send it around the world. Never while I was at Penn or anywhere else. Nothing wrong. I don't think Penn is unusual, but it just never came up. It was never a category of analysis whatsoever. So, I find myself complicit in that, and I'm just ashamed and shocked and wondering, maybe I'm the only one in that category. So when I think of surprises, that was probably the biggest one. And how can that even be surprising? But it was. Another surprise, I guess, is I am surprised that again, the study of race and gender, Ruth did all the heavy lifting on gender, let's say that. But where is it now? Who has taken it up? How many of us have taken it up? It has still not become, I would say, you can argue with me, I haven't been to SHOT for a couple of years, but as far as I can tell, it is still a minority category. And it's not marbled through the field like I think a lot of us thought it would be. Again, I'm as guilty as anyone, but it's kind of shocking when you think about it. What have we done? One of the other surprising things that I have discovered, what happened when I was doing research for the book Every Farm a Factory, and one ridiculous surprise from that book, and I got that title from Debbie Douglas, who found it in an ad for Ford Motor Company, I think, about you could use your Ford to do field work and hook it up to this and to that. And so I used the quotation, Every Farm a Factory, which when I was in Taiwan on some business a few years ago, I discovered they thought it was a book telling them how to make every farm a factory. And they ordered tons of copies of it. So that was a win for our side. But, one of the things in writing that book I discovered, and it really kind of blew me away, is the fact that, I think of technology as being a workaround. Technology is so often politics in another disguise, mm-hmm. right? It's the creation of objects that get you from here to there when there's something in the way. When you can't really just do the thing you want to do, you have to do a workaround, which is by way of a technology that seems utterly apolitical, lacking economic meaning, lacking social meaning. many technologies take on this shape. And when I was writing this book, and it was about developing an industrial ideal behind, around which the agricultural elite could push industrial farming, I was shocked to discover that the same ideal, that the Russians hired Americans who believed in that ideal to come and show them how to do it. And it was Americans who drew up the plans for the first 5-year plan and for the first industrial state farms. So suddenly, it's like there's some kind of a universality of principles or of problems that need to be solved in a way that is not political or difficult. And it's happening in this country that we think is being completely opposite from our own in many respects. So that kind of blew me away. And actually, my new colleague, Kate Brown, wrote a brilliant article on this, why Montana and Kazakhstan are the same place, which really captures that whole idea of the flexibility of our analytical categories and the kind of answers we might find. So it's hard to anticipate that, but it's sure fun when it does happen.
Thank you. I'm going to end on a very different note. I'm talking about surprise, things that surprised me, but it's not like anything else that has been discussed. The thesis of More Work for Mothers surprised me. I started that project because I wanted to begin thinking about more seriously technology and social change. It was a big subject in the end of the 60s, the beginning of this. Not technology, not the history of technology, but how does technology cause social change, which is, of course, the deterministic line that everybody took in those days. So I was very tired, as I've mentioned before, of writing about the history of biometrics and genetics and heredity studies. And I decided that following what was Tom Kuhn's motto, you can't study a science you don't understand, I began to think to myself, well, what technology do I understand? And I was washing dishes one day when I realized I understood the technology of doing housework. So I figured I'm going to do a really short, it was going to take me 6 months. Okay? I'm going to do a really short study, and I'm going to do it through, there must be data on the diffusion of washing machines and dishwashers over time. And there must be data on social change. Well, the first thing I discovered, there is no such thing as social change in data. There's only social variables that change. So I said, no problem. I'm going to look at married women's workforce participation and the diffusion of technology. Well, first of all, it turns out there is no public data, despite the fact that a whole lot of non-historians say this, that we all know that 77% of households in 1920 had electric irons. We don't actually know that. The advertisers have told us that. There is no data on it because the census didn't count such things in 1920. So here I am with this, what's going to take a 6-month project, and all of a sudden, there is no data on one end of it, and there's no data on the other end. And when I began to find the data on the other end, I discovered the hypothesis was completely wrong. That is, advent of the diffusion of of electric and gas technologies into, that is natural gas technologies, into households was inversely related to married women's workforce participation. And a whole lot of sociologists knew about married women's workforce participation, but nobody had ever tried to correlate it. So there I am about 1.5 years into this project, and I discovered I had the wrong hypothesis. And that was the surprise, that there was no relationship between. Then I began to ask myself, why did I think there was? And that's when I realized the advertising industry. I'd learned that from the ads in women's magazines, which I read as a child because that's what was in my house. My mother read them, so I read them. Then I began to realize that advertisers are hired by manufacturers. And that's when the systematic use of that wrong statement, that this is going to make your life easier, and this is going to make your housework easier, and this is going to make you happier, and this is going to make your family happier, was all coming to me from advertising. And so what happened was that I was jotting down how I wanted to summarize this. And then I realized that someone had spoken, I guess yesterday, about making science sing. What I discovered is how you get objects to talk. And that's what I love about the history of technology, is that once you understand where this object came from, what political purpose and cultural purpose it served, and you can understand that from the way it's projected to consumers, advertising, media, whatever, the history of technology is a whole different enterprise. It covers, as the title, it's not the reason why I read technology and culture, but technology is an essential part of culture. It is both affected by it and affects it. And that was my big surprise that turned me into an historian of technology.
Thank you all. I'm going to ask you all now, I'm going to ask our panelists to, before we open up the floor to questions and have what I hope will be a robust conversation, I'd like you guys to just briefly talk a little bit more about your own intellectual journey and how what you've read or written has changed you. Because this question, I'll be honest, this came from I think that's why we do this, right? We go into this deciding we're going to read all of these books and write these books because we want to be different. We want to learn things. We want to be changed. And so I'm interested, in hearing you guys talk about, reflect on your intellectual journey.
The thing I read that transformed my scholarship was written by Thomas Park Hughes, and it was Networks of Power. Anybody who's read my book, More Work for Mother, and then read my book, Hope and Heredity and Hope, will know that I found systems through what Tom wrote. And actually spoke also at the first what is it called, that yellow and black book? Social Construction of Technology conference. That's where I first learned about Tom's work. And then I went home and read it. And the two books are completely different because I learned about systems from Tom. And it's the first time I began to understand, which is now also in my textbook, A Social History of American Technology, what a techno-scientific system is, or a socio-technical scientific system is. And that's why I love and I said as Tom pointed out to me, a little bit fairy tale about the Penn department, but overall still true, that they're all systems and they're all related to each other.
So I'll just mention kind of a couple of broad adjacent fields of study that have been really influential for me. The first actually is one that's been already mentioned a few times, and that's the history of work and labor. I think it's really central, of course, to classic studies of the history of industrialization, but it's, of course, as has already been pointed out, really useful for thinking about scientific labor and knowledge making and practice more generally. The place of the individual in relation to larger structures. And so I keep coming back to some of these, foundational texts in the history of labor. I think they've really followed me and shaped how I think. The second field is sound studies. For me in particular, reading works by people like Jonathan Stern and Mara Mills and Emily Thompson early in my training really helped me conceptualize what it would look like to historicize sensory experience, both intellectually and really in the practical mechanics of writing, and how to think about the role of technology in that process. And the third is disability studies. As someone who is interested in the body, I've been really inspired by the way that scholars in disability kind of denaturalize the body, the way they talk with real empirical specificity about the many textures of bodily experience, and how that has implications not just for scholarship, but for the way we live and for, in fact, the way I teach. There are lots of other fields to mention, art history and architectural history, media studies. I think these are also actually places where a lot of history of technology is being done now. Technology and culture, or even history and technology, which I also love. I was going to give a shout out to a great issue on the history of technology and religion that I would, but I think those are not the boundaries of the field. And so one of the challenges is thinking about how do we interact with people in media studies and people in literary studies who are also thinking about technology, but doing it in a different way. And what can we take from them, and what do we actually want to keep as central to our own practice? And for me, that is materiality, and attention to objects and their function, maybe not making diagrams of smelters all of the time, but continuing to pay attention to how materiality really shapes practice. And I'll just end by saying I certainly didn't discover all of these adjacent fields on my own. I think it was really central to my education at Penn. Looking back on my orals lists, all of these things were present and encouraged by the faculty, and I think that's how being in this program in particular shaped my intellectual development, allowed me to be creative, allowed me to play a bit. At my dissertation defense, I recall John Tresh told me that he thought I had done a very brave thing in picking my topic, which is a little bit like someone telling you you've worn a very brave outfit. I wish I had known that in advance, but I actually think this is the kind of place that really encourages that, and for which I'm very grateful.
I think I'd like to characterize my intellectual trajectory and the role that Penn played in it in terms of who I have felt beholden to or accountable to over the course of my career. Because when I started in 2008 in the History of Science department at Harvard, it is not an exaggeration to say that I felt most beholden as a young and aspiring historian of mathematics and computing to mathematicians and computer scientists. And there were a number of reasons why I was made to feel that way, not least my advisor, who is a dear friend and colleague now, Peter Gallison. This is not to say anything of his advising of me, but he encouraged me throughout my time in the PhD program to, can you get a master's in math? Could you do a PhD in math? How about in computer science? Could you? And that was advice that was meant to protect me. Because as we knew from the experience of, for example, Michael Mahoney's book on Pierre de Fermat being torn apart viciously by a prominent mathematician, we know from discourse on the Sigsys listserv that many of us are still being called out for having no right to speak about mathematics or computing if we do not have the technical chops to practice them as well. And history of computing within the history of technology remains one of the fields with the closest connections to the technical people whose history we study. And I worked very hard to be accountable to mathematicians and computer scientists. I have invested years of my life in studying the technical material. Tom Haig is here, so Tom can tell me if I'm on or off about this, but I think I'm pretty far now on the technical end of historians currently practicing in computing, and I'm proud of that, and I think there's a lot of work that can be done when you've invested deeply in technical understanding of your field. However, it meant that for the first almost decade of my career, I wrote every talk and every article out of fear, rather than excitement or passion or many other things, that there would be some guy in the room who would make it his business to discredit me publicly for not having enough technical expertise to make the claims that I wanted to make. And I see the dominance of that fear in my early scholarship in a very pronounced way. And I wanted to open that way to say that I no longer feel beholden to mathematicians and computer scientists, although I do, I used to wear it as a badge of honor to be invited to mathematics conferences and computing conferences, and I still do, and I'm happy to be able to wear the hat of representing our fields in technical spaces sometimes. But it just became increasingly clear to me that these are not the people that I want to be in conversation with. And these are not the questions I want to ask. This is not the impact I want to have. I don't want my job to be to help mathematicians and computer scientists be more critical of themselves. If they were listening to us, they would be there already. So I really lost interest in framing my entire career around being sure that I had the technical qualifications to make the claims that I cared about. And I really feel that in the history of my short, as yet still very short academic career, that coming to Penn was one of the most liberating things that could have happened for somebody who grew up sort of fearing mathematicians and computer scientists. And I want to share, I remember very clearly the day of my campus visit. It's traditional to have lunch with the graduate students. We sort of went around the table, and there was not I commented on it at the dinner at the end of the day as well. There was not one graduate student at that table who introduced themselves as a historian of X, where X was a traditional scientific discipline, which was the Harvard way. You were a historian of the life sciences or of the physical sciences or of chemistry, and then you would specify your sub-region and period. And instead, I met Katya Babinsteva, who introduced herself as a historian of teaching machines in the Soviet Union at the intersection of the history of psychology, the history of pedagogy, and the history of computation. I met people like Elaine Lefay, whose project is like a medical and embodied history of the wind. And I thought, wow, let's go. Like, this is interesting. Maybe these are my people. This is the kind of project that gets us out of being beholden to technical practitioners by not taking for granted the terms of the disciplines that they have established. And so coming to Penn for me was in part sort of being given permission to let go of the fear I had of not having the technical chops to talk about math and computing in the ways that I might have wanted to. And the sort of shifting gears of to whom we are accountable and to whom we are beholden, for me, have only continued to change since that moment, and sort of echoing some of what John has said, and Amy and Joanna and many others today already. We are all reckoning with this question right now of who we are beholden to. And we are not beholden to scientists. We are beholden to the people who live at the mercy of their inventions and creations. And we are not beholden to our senior colleagues, even when we love and respect them very dearly. We are beholden to the students who are inheriting the products of the histories that we study. And so my intellectual trajectory has in large part been about trying to get myself out of the state of fear and beholdenness that I felt to the science whose history I study. And Penn played a huge part in that for me. And having moved to a school of communication, which is a field that is a lot more sort of in its design public facing. There are a lot of people who come from media, television, film, a lot of policy making discussions with policymakers happen in the field of communication. That's felt like another good move for me in trying to think of how to get our knowledge out of the university in ways that serve the communities we would like to serve. That's one way to tell the trajectory of my career.
Thanks. So first of all, thank you. That is actually it's a very flattering prompt to imagine it as a journey, because often I feel like I was shot out of a cannon several decades ago and I haven't landed yet. So it's nice to think of it as a journey. But and I do feel like I am. I mean, they're both true, because I feel like I am. It's amazing. I feel like I'm constantly learning and I'm never going to be done. But I mean, I think as a journey, a couple things. I mean, I just want to again make a nod to maybe the idea of history as a discipline, which I think, Jeremy mentioned this morning, but there's also, I think, a sense that the way that transnational history has grown and changed and done amazing things over the last generation or so that we no longer talk about comparative history. We no longer even the word global it's kind of more of a verb at this point, but I think that for me, partly editing the journal, which we often turned over to guest editors, and again, because we're not affiliated with an organization that does not have a national home, we often had guest editors who were really deeply provincializing the idea of the nation as the unit of analysis. So, and probably not coincidentally, they would also never, I don't think, have delineated themselves as historians of technology and not historians of science and medicine at the same time. So there was a fabulous issue that was edited by Gabriela Soto de Vaga and Pablo Gomez. There was another one by edited by Gisela Mateus and Edna Suarez Diaz, and these were sort of speaking to, at, and against the history of technology as a discipline in ways that was incredibly generative. These were all over the last, I guess, 4 or 5 years, and that's been incredibly helpful to me because I was trained as an Americanist, and I am now often the only Americanist in the room, which is a good thing. But I'm trying to at least hit the point where I'm not so obviously an Americanist, and that's very exciting. And then another part of the journey for me has been that I have to kind of admit to myself that the current book I am writing is in many ways not merely a rewrite, but an unwriting of the last book. And the last book was about the whiteness of engineering in the United States from the 30s through the 90s, and how segregation and then affirmative action and integration, affirmative action, civil rights movement did not really represent a remaking of engineering. It began in the United States as a project of whiteness, and it remains so. So in some ways, I could have characterized that book as, okay, look, this is the failure of civil rights. This is the failure of integration. It just didn't do what it was supposed to. And of course, the implication there is that, there's something we can do to get to that space. But I no longer believe that. I feel fairly strongly that the difference between an integrationist sensibility and a reactionary, anti-affirmative action, or even anti-black sensibility, or we could even say white supremacy, that's not a binary. From a different perspective, those are very, very close together in the scale of racial ideology. If what we put on our scale are actually some of the ideas that come from disability studies, post-work, anti-cure ideologies, but also truly challenging frameworks from Black intellectual traditions, not just Afrofuturism, but Afro-pessimism. And I just would say work like that of Andre Brock and Charles McIlwain, which I've sort of come to understand. Both of them have written about Black communities' engagement with digital technologies. And yes, the digital divide configures those experiences, right? Yes, being Black in America is deeply disadvantaging from certain perspectives. It is also an instant that history doesn't just have instances of, it is an instance of joy and ingenuity and magnificence. And so I feel like with that kind of historical, literature, with that historiography, the familiar positioning of what I thought were historical studies of race and engineering look very different. And so I'm sort of, let's just say this book will make rather different points than the last one. But I'm curious if those reframings also can carry us beyond just our considerations of race, and certainly beyond our considerations of U.S. history. And I think that's where the imperial and studies of imperialism and coloniality, right, can just be an incredible basis for our study of what we at one point would have called American history. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
I should have gone first. I see that now. Well, I guess, first I was thinking about what are the books that I've read that changed me or had a big impression on me. And I hadn't really put this together until I thought about that prompt. But the things that have really helped me figure out what I want to write about, what I want to do research about, none of them have been academic books, first of all. Nothing against academic books. God knows we produce gobs and gobs of them. I guess one of them is an academic book, to say the least, and that's Bruno Latour's Science in Action, which really blew me away. And I know that's not a popular position to take, but I really found his playful, snarky, in-your-face approach appealing, and I liked his effort to put himself in a variety of positions vis-a-vis the subject. That was kind of a sleight of hand that I'd never seen before, and I thought, man, that is so useful in thinking about a whole bunch of topics that I'm interested in. But the other books were really not academic at all. One of them was a book, and you probably don't know these books. One of them was a book written by Doug Harper called Working Knowledge, which is about a guy living in upstate New York who works on cars and is a fixture in his community as the only guy with mechanical knowledge. So he fixes everything. Everybody's everything. Everyone knows him. He fills a role in the community that is unbelievable. And it's just the most beautiful book, one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. And the second one I have to call out, again, is not well known in the field, is a trilogy by John Berger, who is known mostly as an art critic, called, it's a trilogy. The trilogy is called I don't know what, but the first book is called Pig Earth. The second one is Lilac and Flag, and the third one is Into Europa. And these are short, kind of almost novella-length true stories about his study of an alpine village in France and its transition from really rural, really old-fashioned, from the beginning of time, into a suburb of an industrial community. And the process that he describes is so kind of brutal and beautiful at the same time, just super moving. And so when I read that, and I thought about the people I'm studying, who are largely American farmers, I thought, I can't make that poetry out of the story I have. But I kind of made a promise to myself, I guess, when I started graduate school, because I came from a very remote place, that if I was going to write something, if I was really going to pull it off and become a PhD in history of science and technology, I wanted to write things that people in my family could get and would like. Or maybe they maybe won't like it, let's get real. But they would at least be able to read it and understand what I was talking about and say, oh, that's a new way of looking. Oh, that's different, is what they would say. But that's always been kind of important to me, kind of important in choosing topics and in choosing the voice that I was going to write in. And it's something that these books, in a weird way, all kind of share. I want to then say one more quick thing about that, which is the sort of commitment to being legible also resonated with me recently when we had a review of our department, which was started in 1976 or 7, depending on who you talk to. And it was started not by historians or anthropologists or anything like that. It was started by the administration of MIT, who was so freaked out about the Vietnam protests, the backlash against the atomic bomb, all kinds of stuff that was going on in science and engineering in the 60s particularly, but into the 70s, that they said, holy cow, we really don't know how to handle this stuff. We need people who can help us figure this out, who can help us explain it, who can help us avoid it, who can help shape the kind of polity around science and technology. We don't know how to do that ourselves. We need those people here. And they created, can you imagine that happening now? They created this little academic department, and it was all about being translators to the public. Not apologists, mind you. They honestly did not mean that. But to be translators and to be people who could say, here's what's going on, here's what's wrong with it, here's what we need to do about it, here's some alternative ways of looking at the world that we think are even more worth looking into. I mean, just to have that public discussion. And again, Debbie Douglas is doing this every bloody day with the MIT Museum, and people who are in science journalism are doing this. But there's a place for us to be doing that. And I kind of feel like my one regret professionally is not taking more seriously the contemporary flavor of what my scholarship is all about. Because we all have a contemporary version of what we care about intellectually around science and technology, almost all of us, right? And it comes into our day-to-day lives as big problems, big challenges, big mistakes, big whatever. And I've never felt comfortable weighing in on that. You know, biotechnology came and went. I said not a word. GMO crops came and went. Nothing for me. You know, it's like, I don't do that. That's not what I do. Well, why not? I should have done. And I now really regret not seeing that that's part of the role, I think, also. I don't know that anyone will ever pick that up, but I think it's something that would, it kind of would behoove us to have a bigger voice than the voice we have just with each other now. I don't think that's enough. I think we should be talking more.
So thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists, but I also want to, we have a few moments left for some discussion and questions. So I'd like to encourage you, if you have questions, comments, please raise your hand. Zachary will find you. While that is in train, we have a break after this, and I want to just take a moment and encourage you to check out the materials across the hall in the Lee Library, pulled together by two of our excellent curators here at Penn, Lynn Farrington and John Pollack, who are back there. Thank you very much. Because Penn has an extraordinary wealth of these collections, which are some of our best things are out there, and it's not just the stuff that I work on. Anyway, please take it away.
Well, thank you for giving me, someone who's not a historian of technology, a lot to think about. I have a question for anyone who feels so inspired to reflect on it. And it's about materiality in the way that I heard several of you kind of draw a contrast between the materiality of history of technology versus the history of ideas or history of theories. And I ask this question not as a kind of like, what is material about the history of technology, but rather like, what is the stakes and what work does it do to frame the history of technology as distinctly material? Because one of the things that I was thinking about as I was listening to this is the way that there's a kind of contemporary political valence to materiality, especially, just kind of in the context of my own work and thinking on the way that anti-trans rhetoric is increasingly kind of positioning trans life and, trans studies as well as ignoring material reality. And so there's this kind of like urgency around what constitutes materiality that I wonder if anyone would want to talk about.
I think that's an extraordinarily wonderful question, which I have thought about almost my entire career, but I've never phrased it the way you did. So I thank you very much for doing that. And I'll just begin an answer because I haven't really thought about it in your terms. But one of the wonderful things for me about doing the history of objects is that they persist. And ideas, you can't trace their history with the same kind of evidentiary security that you can trace the evolution of an object or the evolution of an object within a system. I don't think that's the complete answer, but it was the first thing that came into my mind.
I'm going to bounce off of that and maybe contradict Ruth a little. I'm not sure, but
it won't be the first time.
Oh, snap! It's a joy to bounce off of.
Yes, and it's a joy to be bounced off by you.
So when I just put together a little collection, the one on new materials, and it came about not because I was particularly seeking out people who were writing on the emergence of materials that were called new in their time and place. For example, the development of, farmed catfish versus wild catfish and timber high-rises, right? But because people who were writing about those things were engaging with really, really uncertain definitions of where the newness began, how it came to be seen as new. And I think what was exciting to me about that is that the difference between ideas or knowledge or design and material utterly disappeared. There is no singular definition of any, and there is no historically settled use of that. And I think in particular about the piece that was written by Darren Hayton, who's a historian of early modern science at Haverford, but he, in this case, wrote about the design of Quaker-sponsored and designed asylums in the very early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, and the newest technologies. So this is for people who were mentally unwell and needed care and needed, frankly, incarceration, according to those caring for them. And the latest technology, to use that word quite deliberately, for carceral, architecture were metal locks and metal bars on windows, right? But the Quaker experts, I don't know if they were physicians or what they would have called themselves, but the caretakers found the noise of the metal lock to be cruel and to be likely to remind the patients of their disability and their inferiority. And so they turned to wood because the locks were soft in their noise and their quiet, right? Now, we'd never get to that understanding of mental illness in that moment. We'd never get to the understanding of what Quaker stewardship meant to the Quakers if we didn't consider the materiality. But to see the materiality as separate from their sense of their own, how appropriate is that they would be the stewards, they would be the designers of the asylum, and what counted as care, right? And I think those things, and the other chapters in that book considered that line differently. But I think, and in some instances, ideas about the body came in, and ideas about taste, and ideas about ethnicity and things. But I think that it behooves us in a way to imagine that the historical moment can support many, many different relationships between technology and material. And then, as I think I said to my panelists earlier when we were chatting, is like, but of course, we're always in the position of having to identify our discipline and identify our people and identify what journal will our work go into. So it's highly possible that the piece that goes into the History of Technology journal and doesn't go into I don't know where the new materialism is published, for us, or say again? Environmental history, right. Right, that's determinative in its own way, but that's kind of I won't go down that avenue. I hope that's a little bit of a response.
I feel that I would be remiss to not take this opportunity for a little bit of shameless self-promotion that relates to the question. The edited volume that Janet Abate, who's back there, and I had come out in August is called Abstractions and Embodiments, New Histories of Computing and Society. Zach Loeb, Katja Babin-Steva both have really fabulous pieces in there. But the volume sort of takes as its core framework the age-old mind-body dualism, which has a very central role to play in the history of computing. But we also tried to make the case in that volume for the idea of mind-body dualism also being a form of social relation. The thesis of the volume is that all computing, whether it's the abstract concepts like a network or the material practice of the embodied labor of certain groups of underpaid laborers from different parts of computing history, we can always see in computing that social relations are being mediated in some way. But we started our afterword with the sentence, who has a mind and who has a body in the history of computing, for the reason that we reinscribe this hierarchy all the time by attending to some people's ideas and other people's labor. And so I think, or I hope, that the volume comes in part as an invitation to think about whose ideas we're tracking in history and whose embodied experience, whose labor we're tracking in history, and if there are ways to do that that don't continue to reproduce the sort of social hierarchies that sort of dualism have built into it, which is not an answer to your very urgent question, Beans, and I would love to read what you have to say on the matter, but I couldn't let that opportunity go.
Thank you so much. I've been informed that we're at time, and I want to make sure we all have time for stretching our legs, etc., before our next panel. So I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists for this great conversation. Thank you all.